It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Rachel Dry, and I don't know when you signed up, but I'm a substitute moderator, so in my case, this panel is called, Am I Good Enough? And you'll tell me at the end. When I was thinking about our subject today, which is likability and the gender gap that we all experience here, I was thinking about a different panel I once moderated, and it was for high school journalism students. And there was also a last-minute fill in there, and it was me and a somewhat famous, well, a cable news famous television journalist in Washington. So whoever you're picturing is probably close to right. And one young woman actually asked the first question, which is often rare in a Q&A session, and she said, I wonder if you could tell us about an obstacle you've faced, how you dealt with disappointment, and how you remained confident moving forward. And the gentleman answered first, and he said, I can't really think of an obstacle. So it is possible that he's so gifted and also was born into such specific circumstances that in fact his way has been relatively clear of obstacles, and given who you're probably picturing, that is true in a certain case. He had a lot of head starts. But it's also possible that the way he was raised and the way society socializes boys and girls to think about risks you take, obstacles you face, and how you bounce back meant that what a woman, or what I would have thought of as a very difficult obstacle that I could spin some lesson about and inspire this next generation of journalists, it didn't register. He didn't keep him up at night. It wasn't an obstacle to him. And so that is the theme that we're going to get to in our brief time together. There's a lot of wisdom on this stage, so I'm going to turn to each of them with a specific question. We'll have a brief conversation, all four of us, and then you'll get time for questions at the end. So you heard their names when we came out, but I'll just start directly here. It's Adam Grant, a New York Times contributor, who I think I've had the privilege of editing before, and organizational psychologist, who has had the privilege of being edited by me before. In the center here, we have Alicia Menendez, who has a book coming out this fall, her first book, called The Likeability Trap, and is a correspondent for PBS. And we have, over on the far side, Reshma Saujani, who runs Girls Who Code, which is a really wonderful organization, and her book is called Brave Not Perfect, which I just heard backstage somebody in the world has tattooed somewhere in their body. I didn't hear. So I'm actually going to start with Reshma because I think of everyone on the stage, she works the most closely with students, with younger women, and I wondered how you might have answered that question about an obstacle you faced or doubt about your own competence when trying something new, and what would you have said to that high school student?
Well, I think today I would have talked about my laundry list of failures. I always say that I failed my way into starting Girls Who Code, but if you had asked me this question probably when I was in my teens or when I was 8 years old, I was a perfectionist. And I've written an entire book about this point, but we definitely socialize our girls to be perfect, and we socialize our boys to be brave. I mean, boys that don't even ask themselves the question, am I good enough, right? And you see how this plays out by going on any playground in America. Right? We tell our boys to climb to the top of the monkey bars and just jump head first. But we tell our girls, be careful, honey, don't swing too high. Did you take that toy away from her? Give it back. Is your dress dirty? Come over here, let me clean you up. We literally coddle and protect and wrap our girls up with bubble wrap. But we raise our boys to be risk takers, right? To be fearless. And when boys become men, they ask for outsized raises. They ask for promotions they're not qualified for. They launch startups with abandon. Different case for us. We get addicted to perfection. We start giving up before we even try. And we see the impact of this in every aspect of our life. You see it in school. Studies show that when women get a B in an economics class, they drop out of their major. We see this in their work. Women won't apply for a job unless they meet 100% of the qualifications. We even see this in our health, right? Women are twice as likely to suffer depression as men. So if women are waiting to be perfect to lead, if women are waiting to be perfect to live, we'll never close the leadership gap. I feel like bravery is the solution to this. I think that when you teach women and girls to be brave, we rewire ourselves and we open ourselves up for joy, and we no longer ask the question, are we good enough? We literally tell that voice in our head to shut the hell up, right? And we pursue the opportunities that we want to pursue, whether it's writing a book, whether it's running for office, whether it's starting a business, whether it's getting out of that toxic relationship or getting out of that job that we just feel like, about. And so I think that, as we're literally in the precipitous, we're seeing 6 women run for president right now, right? We're seeing bravery on the biggest stage possible. But nothing changes unless we really teach and inspire everyday bravery. And that's what I feel like I've been spending a lot of my time talking about and writing about.
Man, I really wish you had been there at that other panel. It's a real privilege to hear that. I want to go next to Adam, and this is another area when I was thinking about the am I good enough question, I think it comes up a lot around rejection, and any risk that winds up in a rejection is immediately seen as, well, the answer is no, I wasn't good enough. And I wondered if you could talk about generally how you see that in organizations and what we know about what the gender gap is there.
Sure. I actually start to see this with students, right? So when women get a B, they do often drop the subject. When men get a B, they're in my office trying to convince me that it, in fact, should have been an A. And I really enjoy that because it captures, no, it's a good opportunity to take their confidence down a level, but it captures something that in psychology we've seen for decades, right? So there's a long-standing pattern of what's called self-serving bias and attributions. So you look at what happens when men and women succeed, and men say, I'm awesome, and women say, I'm lucky. And then on failure, men are very quick to blame it on someone else and say, look, it's not me, it really is you. Whereas women are much more likely to internalize a rejection or a difficulty or an obstacle and say, no, this is all my fault. And I realize I've never been a woman, right? It's hard for me to say that and experience it, but as a social scientist, it's a pattern that comes up in the data over and over and over again. And there's some recent research led by Marian Alberly, which I love. The idea that actually we're making the wrong attribution in both cases. That most of the time when you get rejected, when somebody turns you down for a job or for a position in school or for a promotion or for a raise, it's not you. It's also not them, it's us. Right? It's actually the fit between you and them, right? So it might have been you were applying to the wrong job. It might have been you were applying to the wrong school. It might have been you wrote the wrong cover letter for that particular application. And what the research on this shows is that if you call that a relational attribution, right? So it's about the fit between me and the context. People who make those attributions, especially women, are then more likely to persist, saying, look, just because I failed in this one situation doesn't mean I am a failure or I'm a reject. They're also more likely to try to learn from it and say, okay, how do I adjust the way that I go for the next opportunity, and as opposed to seeing it as a threat to their ego. And so I think it's not you, it's not me, it's us is a pretty simple starting point for dealing with rejection.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So Alicia, the am I good enough question, I started with rejection, but I think the other realm it plays out in is, should I try this new thing? Should I take this risk? And Alicia, I wonder if you could talk about how you think about that, especially in terms of likability, and are they going to like me if I try it?
Right. I think sometimes the question when we want to try something new is not, am I good enough? I was raised to be a very brave and confident girl, so I say, yes, I am good enough. The question becomes, will other people think I'm good enough? And if I carry myself as though I think I'm good enough and other people disagree, do I then become less likable in that context? So I had started writing a book about how much I care about whether or not other people like me, with the original objective of learning to care less. And what I learned from talking to other women is I imagined women who didn't care to be like out there living their best lives and marching to the beat of their own drummer. And what I realized is they too pay a price for being brazenly themselves, especially women who are ambitious and strive to lead. And what I realize is that often happens in the early part of a woman's career, right? So she comes into the workplace, oftentimes with a ton of confidence, wants to try a ton of new things, and somewhere along the way she is told that something about the way she comports herself is a problem. And the word problem is rarely used, but that's what it is, a problem. She is either too soft, too warm, not seen in the eyes of other people as a leader, or too strong, too assertive, too aggressive, too much, needs to tone it down. The problem is not that she's doing it wrong, it's that it's nearly impossible for a woman who strives to lead to do it right. And so part of what I think we've gotten wrong in the context of women in work is that in the interest of empowering women, which we certainly need to do, we've place too much onus on the woman herself, on the individual, on how much she cares or doesn't care, on how she sits in her chair, on how she talks, and how she uses her hands, and not enough structurally on shifting away from how she does her work and focusing instead on the work itself, focusing our feedback more on the quality of her work rather than the style with which she does her work. So we can talk about those structural changes either now or on a different panel. But for the woman herself, there were two things I heard that I thought were really helpful as a shift away from thinking about likability, which was one, having real clarity of vision and being able to clearly communicate that clarity of vision, especially in a work context, so that if you're saying to your team, we're gonna try this new thing, you're very clear about why you're trying that new thing, what your objective is in trying that new thing. And the other thing I heard a lot about was self-awareness, and being very clear with oneself about one's intentions around new projects, new opportunities, what's motivating that, and that if you were like me and you were hyper-focused on how other people think about you and whether they like you, sometimes having a new place to focus all your neuroticism is a great way to shift your attention.
That's the most relatable advice I've ever heard. Why pretend you can wave a magic wand and do away with the neuroses? Just direct them where they belong. Thank you all so much for that. I wondered if we could kick off the conversation sort of where Reshma started. How early would you have to intervene so in 25 years, a Wharton professor, or still you'll probably be there, wouldn't be noticing that gender gap in his or her office? What would it look like to try and even the playing field on that playground?
I mean, I think as early as you possibly can. So this starts happening at 30 months old, where you start seeing, even if you watch little kids build blocks, right? Girls will build very low, stable structures. There's a nice story to go with it. Boys just build up high and just kick, right? And I think from the youngest of possible ages, we are socialized to treat our kids differently. So my husband and I, we got into a huge fight about a nightlight. Basically, my 4-year-old son came to me, and yes, I have a son. It's very off-brand, but I'm okay with it.
It's very brave.
It's very brave.
Yeah, it's brave, not
Yes.
perfect. Yeah.
So Sean comes to me and says, Mommy, I'm afraid of the dark. So I go to Bye Bye Baby, I buy the nightlight, right? We go upstairs, I plug it in. I go to my room. 2 minutes later, my husband in the hall comes upstairs, takes out the nightlight. And we do this thing. Finally, a couple days later, I'm like, no, what's your problem? He's afraid of the dark. My husband, my house, my radical feminist husband, looks at me and says, we gotta toughen him up. So I say, no, if Sean were a girl, would you let him have the nightlight? And he's like, fine. But again, right, we are literally hardwired. And so I believe that it's so important for us to just watch ourselves and even the smallest of behaviors. Like I had a girlfriend whose baby she was learning how to walk, and she was following her coming up the stairs, and she was saying, be careful, be careful, be careful. And then she's like, oh no, Reshma, okay, go baby, go baby, go baby, right? She had changed her entire reference. And so let them tinker, let them take things apart, let them get really dirty. Don't let them walk away when they get frustrated. But the other part of this is that it's not too late for you, the women I'm talking about. Nothing makes me more mad when women come up to me and be like, I'm buying my book for my daughter. I'm like, no, you read it. You read it, because if you don't change, they're not gonna change. And it is never too late, right? It is never too late to be brave. It is never too late to rewire yourself. We have to think about bravery like it's a muscle that you build. Like it's something that you fall on and off the wagon, on and off the wagon. And I actually think, quite frankly, The bravest women I know are 60, 70, 80 years old. They are most authentically living like Cardi B, no F's given, right?
Yeah, let's take a moment for the no F's given demo.
True,
Yeah.
right? It's true, and I think that it's really kind of most of us in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s that have to remind ourselves that we don't have to do everything perfectly, that we have to live a life of imperfection, right? That we don't have to always care what people think. I mean, in the smallest ways too, and I'm gonna be quiet, it's like every woman I know is exhausted.
Yes.
We are exhausted. And the thing is you can't be brave if you're tired. But we still, we postpone those doctor's appointments. Come on, raise your hand, right? Suddenly, it became too selfish for us to go to the doctor. When did that happen, right? So if we can start reconditioning ourselves and remind ourselves they are watching us. Every time you judge yourself, every time you question yourself, your daughter is listening to you and she is replicating your behavior.
Did you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, just to the point about women being exhausted. So, like, I spoke with all these women who were told they were too much or too little. I finally find this unicorn who's in Silicon Valley and is like hitting the exact right mark of being strong. And she says to me, "And I'm exhausted." and I said, "Well, you know, who would you be? How would you lead if you could just do it?" And she gave me some answer, and then she said, "Oh no, those are BS CEO talking points." And so I think that is true, that women are doing a lot of performance, either performing leadership or performing confidence, and that is just as exhausting as not having it in the first place. But I also want to say, as someone who's raising a girl, very on brand, that there's a part of the larger arc of her life that scares me too, which is that I am raising her to be brave. She is the kid on the monkey bars who falls and gets up and she's fine and she's dirty all the time. But I'm gonna send her into a world that is not necessarily going to receive her confidence with the same love and affection that my husband and I do. And that's the part, having been that girl, that I grapple with, which is that even if you do all the parenting things right, we still have a cultural shift that has to take place to welcome and embrace that girl and that sensitive boy, to your point about the fact that we just have these very gendered notions of what strength and leadership look like into the world. And that shift, I think, is a much slower, harder shift.
So I want to talk about sort of the inverse of that, but it's also about how the world will receive people and the professional world. What happens, you know, if you've overcorrected a little bit? Like, you know, it wasn't a fit. Like us, we didn't do it. Like your formulation, the match wasn't correct, and you weren't good enough for that particular thing, and you've been told, don't think that, don't have that language in your head. And
Rachel, be more specific, because you're clearly talking about a
Do
specific.
you want to quit?
so, okay, so here's
I know. I was
so,
like, Rachel, do you want to quit your job?
I'm gonna give the, no, is Meredith still in the room? No. I would give a very specific example. Until last week, I was the editor of Sunday Review at the New York Times, and I read a lot of unsolicited submissions, and a lot of them were great, and a lot of them, literally the language I used was, this is not a fit for us. And there are a certain cohort, mostly of younger people, a good gender mix, who would write back to that and say, are you sure? Can you tell me why? Which is, I'm sure a lot of people in this room get a lot of email. No, don't write back to the email with more email, it's done. And I wonder about that you want to teach people to push and be confident and turn off the am I good enough voice. But it is a liability in the world you're talking about, and it can not always work to your advantage. So I don't wonder if you could take that one.
Yeah, I think there's a parenting version of this and there's a workplace version of it. I think the parenting version is we always put the expectations and the pressure on the girls, right? So we need to encourage girls to take more risks and to try new things and to be brave. I'm all for that. I also think the world would be a slightly better place if we taught boys to be just a tiny bit more careful. Right? Maybe one of the reasons women are so exhausted.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Maybe, right? Maybe we wouldn't have had a financial crisis or multiple wars that didn't need to be fought, right? If men were actually taught to second guess themselves before they made decisions. And so I think that's important, right? I think when you take this into the workplace, I think we get a lot of messaging around growth mindset that sometimes pushes us in the wrong direction.
Wait, sorry. I don't actually work very much in the corporate. Can you define growth mindset?
Yeah, so Carol Dweck would define it as the belief that your intelligence, your skills, your personality traits are all malleable, right? As opposed to saying, look, I'm set like plaster, I'm fixed and I can't change.
Okay.
And I think this is largely a good thing, right? On average, you want your kids, you want your employees, you want your boss to have a growth mindset. Otherwise, they tend to give up when they fail or get rejected, and they tend to stagnate a lot. I worry, though, that growth mindset can be pushed too far. And I worry about those people who write op-eds and don't take the feedback and say, look, I am capable of becoming a world-class writer. In the same way that I was really determined when I was in 9th grade to be an NBA basketball player. Just not going to happen, right? And so I would like people to try to get realistic data on their abilities. To ask, look, did I get rejected because I am fundamentally not good at this skill? Number one. And then number two, how learnable is this skill? Yeah. And I think we often don't ask that question, right? Not all people can grow equally in all areas. And so I would say you submit that op-ed to multiple newspapers, maybe you write multiple op-eds, and then if all of your styles of writing get rejected from all of the papers that you submit to, maybe it's time to consider a different profession.
Yeah.
I think the danger, though, of this, Adam, and I agree, is that, like if we all had the confidence of a mediocre white man, the world would look a little different, right? Like, the world is kind of run by a lot of mediocre white dudes. And so they're not hearing what you're saying. We're hearing what you're saying. Every time I speak at a technology company, sure enough, there's a group of female engineers sitting in the back, and they say, Mr. Johnny, can I talk to you? And I say, yes. And they say, I just don't feel like I belong here. I don't feel like I'm smart enough. I don't feel like I'm good enough. And so it's so hard in a world where there's so much mediocrity and male privilege that we don't address. And the rest of us, we had to be twice as good to be sitting on this stage. Let's be honest, right? Most of the women who are running companies, most of the female engineers, we had to be twice as good as the rest of them. And so when we hear that, we're like, what do? We might as well as not try at all. And so it's almost like I feel like we have to have that conversation for the men in the room and not the women.
One last quick lightning round, and then we'll open it to the audience here. So you are all authors, and when you write a book, you have to sell a book. And many of us in whatever field we're in have to promote our work, ourselves, our ideas, something. How do you do effective self-promotion while shutting out the, am I good enough? People are going to be annoyed by this email voice that can be a constant refrain. Adam.
Don't ask me, Alicia.
No, I literally have no
You're on
idea.
camera. How do you deal with this?
I stay up at night asking myself this question, but you seem to be doing it really well.
Oh, God.
All right, Reshma, let me ask you a question.
Okay,
Which is, I felt like when I launched my first book, people were pushing me to promote myself. And what helped was to say, I'm not promoting myself, I'm promoting my ideas.
1,000%.
And I believe in my ideas.
Yeah.
Is that what you've done? Are there other useful things that we should be doing?
No, I think that's right, but I'm not going to lie that it's not hard, right? Because we're like ambitious women. Look, Brave Not Perfect did incredibly well, number 4 on the bestseller list. You know what I kept thinking when I went home at night? Why didn't I sell as many books as Michelle Obama? Why is she number 1 and I'm number 4? It's ridiculous. It's crazy, right? It's just so much conditioning comes with almost every single thing that we do. So I feel like I have to constantly have this conversation with myself that you are enough, that you are good enough. But I do think that once you move away from reframing what you're trying to do, you're right. It's not about you. Right? It's about the idea. I had the best thing happen to me ever yesterday. I was in Vegas. That was not the best thing. That was the worst thing. But I was walking down in this casino, and this woman grabs me, and she says, "Are you Reshma?" And I said, "Yes." And she throws out her hand, and she had tattooed Brave Not Perfect on her hand. That is what it's all about, right? Is lots of tattoos.
And now she's doing the promotion for you. So I've been not great at managing the clock, but I would love to hear 2 questions for this panel from the people in this room. So I see a hand right there. Let's get you a microphone.
So I love your stories about...
Oh, sorry, can you introduce yourself first?
Tammy Rosen. I work at Luminar Technologies. I'm a chief people officer. And I live in Silicon Valley, ex-New Yorker. ex-finance, so a lot of X's. Anyway, I love your story about teaching your children and helping to like make them the best they were, and that's what my mother did for me, and that's what I'm doing for my daughter who's just graduating. But the realities do stand to what you said, is when they go into the workplace, it's a different workplace. When they go to college, it's a different college experience than maybe what they had in high school, and adapting is just so hard, and they fall into those I'm not good enough moments. So what is your advice to help those transitions? And as me as a chief people officer, I'm trying to create that structure within my own company, but ideas that you've seen that have worked to allow for people to assimilate and be themselves but not be someone different.
Adam, do you want to take that one in like the work context?
Yeah, sure. There's a great experiment that Francesca Gino, Brad Stotz, and Dan Cable did at Wipro in India, where they took new hires and they randomly assigned them to either be broken into the company, where they get to learn all about the culture and figure out how they can fit in, or they're encouraged to engage in self-expression. And they actually write about, in that case, their personal highlight reel, the moments when they were at their best, and then how they could bring those strengths to the table. And that group ends up, over the next 6 months, with higher performance, and they're about half as likely to quit. And I don't think we're good at this, right? I think when we bring people into organizations, we mostly think we're supposed to socialize them and say, look, you're now here, you need to drink our Kool-Aid and become one of us. I think the reality is we want to do the opposite. The reason we hired you is we think you're extraordinary, and we think you have a lot of potential. We want to find out what your capabilities are and what your interests are so that we can leverage those. And to me, that's the starting point for a good relationship between employee and employer.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have time for one more question. Can I go right here? Sorry, let's just wait for the microphone because we're streaming it, and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Taryn Mahoney. I'm at AE Networks, and I do direction of portfolio strategy from New York. My question is for you, Alicia. I think in my experience, and this may not be everybody's, I felt ignored by men that I work with or work for, but with women that I work for, I felt active kind of backlash more often in a likability capacity, at least when I am reporting to or peers with. I've been told I sit too much like a man and it's offensive. When I'm authentically, I'm a pretty shy person normally, but in a work capacity, I get a little bit more narrow and hyper-focused and confident. But I wonder if there's anything you've found in likability that speaks to gender on gender.
The backlash question, yeah.
This is the first time talking about this in person, so it is so edifying to know that it resonated with even one person. So thank you, and let's talk after. The one thing I heard from an executive coach that I thought was really helpful, given how much subjective feedback women get around their work, is to ask, compared to whom? So that when someone says, well, first of all, no one should ever be talking about the way you sit in your seat. That's outrageous. You should just call them out on that. But when someone says you're very loud, compared to whom? You don't speak up enough in meetings, compared to whom? And that very often, that subtle pushback will force the reviewer or the person who's giving you that feedback to consider just how subjective it is. I think more broadly, the responsibility shouldn't fall on you. I think, again, that we need to start thinking about reviews as a place where we talk about the work people do and not the style with which they do their work, because it puts you in a precarious position, right? If you're in that review and you reject that feedback, then you all of a sudden become the problem, right? You validate the exact subjective feedback that you've been given. So my point is you should not be in that position in the first place. But I also understand that you need to gut through your life and your work and do what you need to do. And I do think those questions of reframing often are the best pushback.
Well, thank you very much, Alicia. And I know you just advised us to not be subjective, but I will subjectively say it was very edifying and wonderful to hear from all three of you. Please join me in thanking Reshma, Alicia, and Adam.